All right, great. Well, hello everyone, and I'm looking forward to visiting a little bit about business continuity planning. And I'll get started by kind of sharing one of my main pieces of experience in this area, and that was you remember this little thing called Y2K? Remember that little fun event?
Those
and
aren't zippers. Zippers
I
are
was working.
YKK, I think. Y2K.
Yeah. So I was working at Walt Disney World at the time, running some of their call centers at Disney in Orlando. And I was drafted to kind of head up the team that developed Walt Disney World's overall business continuity plan for Y2K. And so I loved getting into that, had a great time doing that. And in doing so, we developed a pretty robust business continuity planning process that is not just applicable for call centers, but really for any organization, any type of business. So I'll start by kind of walking through that, and I do want to welcome any comments, thoughts, questions as we go through this. So as part of our business continuity planning process, we started out by identifying the roles and responsibilities of our team and who's involved in a business continuity plan and who's in charge of it, who are key players, who are the customers on the one end, who are the technical people that are going to be responsible for executing pieces of it. So you define your roles and responsibilities, you set up your key business processes. So you identify kind of what are the most important things that we want to look at for a business continuity plan. What are the things that if we can't do those, our business is going to suffer. Things are going to really go south quickly if we can't get those business processes completed. And then we looked at what are the threats to those. And obviously in Y2K, one of our big ones was power, the loss of power. So we addressed that, but also there's a lot of other things, and we'll talk about threats here in just a few minutes. And then what is the impact of it? Some things, may not be worthy financially to do a whole lot of planning, but others may, so what is the impact financially to your business? And if something does go down and you're not able to recover quickly. And then we looked at what are some of the preemptive actions. So what are some of those things we can do ahead of time to be ready in case we did have an outage of some type? And then what are the workarounds? So, an outage may last a little while. What are the workarounds? How can you manually get around? Maybe you lose a key system or you lose internet access. What are some of the workarounds that you could do to continue to provide some level of service to your customers? And then really important, and people don't really think about this, but how do you activate the different components in your business continuity plan? What are the triggers that say when this happens, this is what we want to do? The last thing you want to do if you've got a true emergency and things are out or down is trying to figure out, okay, when do we pull the trigger? When do we do this? That should be predefined, ready to go, and you're just executing your plan at that point. An important step that some people don't put in their business continuity plan is how do we return to normal? So if I had to go to a manual method at my call center and I've had to use, a different method of logging tickets because I lost my CRM or my ticketing system, then, how do I get back into getting that data back into the systems where I don't lose any of the call history and information there for customers? So that kind of was our overall plan. And then we went around to all the business units at Disney and met with them and created a pretty detailed plan. And all right, well, let me jump on into our what I call possible failure areas, and then I'm going to hone more in on call center type of work because that's our audience and everyone's focused on today. So obviously we've got the big five here: the internet access. So losing internet access this day and age is a big deal. Having physical building issues. So I was doing work for one of my clients, and one of the first things we did was create a business continuity plan for a large call center down in Mexico City. And part of our continuity plan was having a secondary location in the States. And we had just spun up and got it running and everything. And you remember a couple of years ago when Mexico City had that really bad earthquake? Well, their call center was virtually shut down for a few days while they were dealing with that. Fortunately, we had our business continuity plan in place and they tested it and we're up and running. So physical building access may be an issue. Maybe you have a natural disaster in your area you have to think about. And some of the call centers are located in parts of the world that might have challenges in those areas. Your phone system. So, losing a phone system access to your IVRs and your prompts, and how do you deal with that? And then your business applications, whether it's a CRM or something else that you use to track your information, your ticketing system. What are you going to do, if you lose access to that momentarily or long term? And then finally, agent availability is the last big one I have on my list of the big five. And that's, if you were to lose some or a significant number of your agents off your call center, say it's a pandemic type issue like we're going through now, and you've got a certain number of people that are really unable to show up for work. But there are other reasons too. I mean, some areas you have to think about. I mean, I know most call centers aren't unionized, but there are still the opportunity if you don't have a positive culture and people decide that something's not going well and they decide to, 20% of your agents call in sick one day, that can happen. How do you deal with that? How do you compensate for that? A couple other things that we look at are in the business continuity planning are the factors, and that's the type of outage. So it could be any of these failure areas. But it's also important to consider the duration. So any good business continuity plan has a tiered level. So something may not be critical if it's just down for a couple minutes, but after 20, 30 minutes, it hits another level of importance. And if it's down a day or 2 days or 3 days, like we were in Mexico City, then a whole nother piece of the plan could potentially kick in. So in all the plans that I work with my call center clients, we have multiple tiers. So we have the different failure areas, but then we also have the durations. And if it's this level, then this part of the plan kicks in. If it lasts for this long, then we have to kick in this piece of the plan and get going on it. And so it's really important to think about the duration. And then as I mentioned, it's the risk and cost analysis. So you can obviously go overboard with business continuity planning and create multiple centers all over the world and all that. So you really have to look at what's the risk, what is potential loss if we do have a major issue, and what is the cost? What's a good cost level to jump into to mitigate some of these issues that you're having or potentially could have? So it's, I've had some organizations that just went, way overboard with their business continuity plan, and they didn't really ever, they would have been great if they had a major disaster, but in some of these cases they never did, and they spent, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars on preparing for stuff. So you have to really think through that, and it's always a balancing act on the planning piece of it. There are times, and part of our business continuity plan may be logging information in a manual Excel sheet, for a desktop, and then how do you consolidate that and then upload that back into your system to where you don't lose that transaction history. And so I think, that's a great point. You do have to reconcile and get back up and running. And I think that's a piece that people leave out. To your point, I do agree that they tend to forget about, okay, we're back up and running. Everyone's just breathing a sigh of relief that the systems are back up, but that's not the end of the game for a business continuity plan. Do you have pre-recorded messages that kind of anticipate certain scenarios? So are you going to have a plan that said we are experiencing, like we did in Mexico City? We were able to come up, but we were really focused on handling mission critical, business critical calls for this call center for our clients. It wasn't that we were going to handle every little call. So we had messages inserted that said we were experiencing a major outage due to a disaster. If you can log online to your system and create a ticket, please do so, and remain on the line if you are, we would spell out what was critical. But we had those recordings ready to go. So we, to your point, when a disaster hits, you don't want to be scrambling around trying to do all this stuff. You want to be executing a plan, and that's it. And being able to flex. There's going to be enough unknown in a disaster that you're going to have a little bit of that going on. But the more you can have thought through and have your plan. I mean, for example, in our plans, we would have, almost a matrix that said, if this happens and it goes on for this long, boom, this is the part of the plan you're executing. And it takes all the question out of it, and you really get to where you can just focus on getting back up and doing what you need to do to take care of your customers. Yeah, and there always will be a certain amount of that being flexible and being ready to go, but the more you could have thought through the scenarios and done the scenario planning ahead of time, the higher likelihood you are that you're going to be able to execute a plan and not have to be scrambling. I know some people who don't spend a lot of time on their business continuity plan, and then something happens and they're scrambling. They don't even have a manual phone list, printed off that they could access, for key business partners and stuff like that they can call. because they're relying on their CRM to be able to pull that up. It's things like that you got to think about and think about, if this goes down, what's the impact and what can I do ahead of time? And for example, a couple of our call centers rely very heavily on a knowledge base for information. So what we would do every month, at the beginning of the month, we would go and we'd say, okay, what were the top 25 knowledge articles that were used for resolution of calls? And we would export those and put them into a flat file system that we could then access manually if we lost our knowledge base. So that was part of our continuity plan that, we could deal with that. But you have to think ahead of time because, the time to go and extract those 25 top things isn't after the system's down.
Sure.
So you have to work on that. So moving on to kind of risk mitigation. So what can we do to mitigate our potential risk? One is having multiple locations. So how many of y'all have multiple locations for your call centers that you manage? So you have the ability and some redundancy that you can move calls around pretty quickly. And if not, there, a lot of places nowadays are just all in one big system and the agents are one big pool and you could do your skill-based routing and all that as you need to. So having multiple locations is really important. And it's important too. Like my client that I was dealing with in Mexico City, the vendor before I got involved claimed that they had a business continuity plan and their plan had 2 locations in Mexico City. Well, that didn't do us much good when an earthquake hit the region. So you have to be thinking about your locations. And then obviously we've all gotten very good at dealing with the remote workforce, but that should be part of every business continuity plan too, is having a certain portion of your agents that are trained, that are pre-certified, that you've already done a home visit. You all have done all these things to verify that they can work safely and securely at home. And you have that ready to go. And that was part of our plan too. We had just branched into having about 20% of our agents were pre-certified to work from home. In fact, about 10 to 15 agents every day were working from home as part of their work routine. So that if something were to happen, we immediately had a portion of our agent pool that could jump on calls. And then you have your redundant access point. So whether it's different internet providers coming in, different providers, different entry points, that you don't have a single point of failure on any of your technology pieces, especially your infrastructure components. And then you're having your manual data access. So how do you get to data if the system's down? How do you prepare for that? As I mentioned, we created some flat files of some of the key information that we needed to look at. We had phone logs and stuff, or phone lists that we could call on for our key business partners to let them know what was going on. And then obviously your system and your data backups and making sure that those are really good and that you've got that all in place. So those are kind of some of the things you can do to mitigate your risk on a call center. And then I'll just wrap up on this piece, and then I really want some additional discussion on this on the planning process. So obviously you're preparing, you're creating your plan, and that's an exercise unto itself. And then the piece that I think probably most people don't do a very good job on is that's really testing your plan. Testing a plan, if you've got a 24/7 center, it can be a little challenging. I mean, for our center there, we actually had to test it. We were testing, okay, the entire Mexico City they're gone. So our call is going to automatically route to Louisville, and we had extra agents on board at Louisville ready to handle it. And then we had a supplemental staff, our IT team, that would come in and be able to answer calls and log tickets and stuff like that. But we would test that typically on a Sunday afternoon, which was their lowest call volume time of the week. And we would run those tests, and we would go through the whole test. And we had a live line open where all the parties were called in, and I was giving instructions on, okay, we're placing these test calls right now. And once we verify that, then we're moving on to phase 2 of the test. And, we walked through that whole process with everyone, but we would do that every quarter. And it was great because, you think after you've done it once, you don't have to keep doing it. But every time we would run into something, and either they're a new team member or something that didn't know what they were doing, and we really had to make sure they were trained, or we had some change in software or something else that needed to be tested. And then, obviously testing and looking at your backups, it's having a process where you go in and say, okay, I've got to restore. And, how am I going to do that? What's the process? I'm going to test, I'm going to create some dummy records and destroy them. How do I go get that data, and how quickly can I do it? So running through that whole test, and then updating your plan is the last piece, making sure that every year you kind of are assessing it, you're looking at it. Have we added new software? Have we added new, processes? Has our, internet changed? Do we need to do new recordings for our IVRs? What's changed that we need to update? So I think those are kind of some of the pieces that are involved